Hello and welcome to episode 174 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips as possible. And we have a great guest today, someone that has gone through the self-publishing into trad publishing world.
Yeah, we're chatting with the fantastic Alexander Darwin, who has written the Combat Codes, which is a really cool, we call it science fantasy, which I think is a really
we discussed how
description.
It was really Fond du Lis that gave him that description.
That's right, so it was, yeah. And it's a really cool idea of a world where when a country goes to war with another country, rather than sending armies to fight each other, they send a single fighter to fight in unarmed combat.
Yeah,
which I think it's just a brilliant concept.
Alex is he teaches I think mixed martial arts and so he brings that expertise into it. But we chat as well about how when you have that expertise, obviously you can bring that sort of real knowledge into the book, but you don't want to overwhelm the reader with it either. So there's a skill in knowing how much to put in, how much to leave out, and that sort of thing as well. So it's a really interesting chat, really interesting hearing how he got his start with the self-publishing, how he made a success of that, and then moved into traditional publishing. So we'll get, and also actually there's a shout out for a previous guest, Nick Binge, and his novel Ascension as well. We chat a bit about that. And before we get into the episode, I did want to just say that if you're in Scotland, near Stirling, on next weekend, the 15th of September, Bloody Scotland, the crime writing festival, is on in Stirling, and Tarek and I are both hosting separate talks with some great authors there. There are tickets still available as far as I know, so you can check those out. I'm hosting the chat with Gilly McMillan, Catherine Faulkner and Stig Abel. Who's your guests, Tarek?
I'm chatting with Will Dean, Amy McCulloch and Catherine Cooper about High Seas, High Stakes, all crime novels set on cruise ships.
Yeah, so obviously if there were some Page One loyal listeners there, then that would be great. But yeah,
maybe we should have a name for them.
I know we need to Pages.
Pages for the one person who turns up in the audience.
We'll come up with a name for those two loyal listeners that we have. But yeah, we'll get straight into the podcast after a quick advert for our Writer's Notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
Did you always want to be a writer?
I think it's a similar story to what I've heard from a lot of friends who are authors, as well as listening to podcasts like these, where I didn't quite know that being an author was an actual profession as a kid. It was just because I didn't have an author in my family. I didn't know any authors that did that as a vocation or a profession, or even on the side, really, to be honest. At least none that told me about it. Maybe they were ashamed. but I was always storytelling and writing fan fiction for the various fantasy sci-fi books that I was reading. I was a big fan of like R.A. Salvatore, Drist books when I was growing up, and Dragonlance, the Chronicles, and I was always in those worlds. But it wasn't until actually I saw I'm from Boston, and there was a Boston Globe article about R.A. Salvatore, and he's local to this area. And that, I think that was the moment when I picked up the physical paper at that time, because we got the paper, and I saw a picture of him, and I said, "Who's that guy?" And then I read the headline, and it said, Bob R.A. Salvatore, local neighbor, and it kind of like clicked, like, wait a second, this is this guy who I've been reading for 10 years is an actual person.
Yeah.
And I think that was the moment when I realized, and as happens to many of us, my path was all over the place. Life and work and kids all were things that came prior to actually pursuing getting published, or rather publishing my book. First, it was self-published, and then getting it acquired by Orbit. So that was kind of the journey.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that, because obviously you did go down that self-published route. Was that a deliberate choice? Had you tried to get agents before, or did you want to try the self-publishing first? How did you end up on that path initially?
Yeah, I think my entire path here has kind of been, I don't want to say, dumb luck, but almost stupidity as far as not knowing what was out there. So like the reason I self-published was not because I knew there was a choice between self-pub and trad. I was working in Silicon Valley. I was living out in San Francisco, and I had just run a startup to the ground, and it failed. And I was in that world where all the web, it was kind of in the early 2000s, rather mid 2000s, and all the web 2.0 tools and social media were just starting to take off. And so when I really just was, I had been writing for my whole life, and I had all sorts of manuscripts that obviously weren't published, that I was just more doing for myself. But then I saw there were tools just through Gizmodo or Wired or one of these magazines that to self-publish. I saw Amazon was obviously making a big play with KDP at that time, and of course read about success stories like Hugh Howey, and Andy Weir, the real big ones. And so I didn't even think about traditional publishing. I didn't think about querying agents. I just said, wow, look at these tools. This is really fantastic. You can do this yourself, and kind of went down that path, almost like starting a new business, even though I was working full time, and kind of figured out that, and had a lot of fun, to be honest. And that's what I tell authors now that, want to self-publish. You really have to run your own business. And if you're going to do it well and distinguish yourself from the mass of other ones, you have to invest. You have to take some risk and invest money, as well as obviously time. And so I went down that path without really knowing that traditional was something that was out there. And so, one thing led to another. Obviously, eventually it got acquired, and I kind of, again, went backwards in the traditional publishing path. But that's a different story.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to that, I'm sure. But just on the self-publishing stuff, how you say approach it like a business, and we have had other guests on the podcast who have been very successful with self-publishing who say the same sort of thing. But I mean, what steps did you take? Did you hire an editor? Did you get a cover designed? All this sort of stuff. What steps did you have to go through before you actually clicked publish on Amazon?
And so again, sort of like I see the combat codes almost like a startup, in that there have been various iterations, including the traditionally published version, which is just coming out now. The first iteration, where I first came upon KDP and the tools, was, I went through the most basic steps. I hired a cover designer, fairly cheap, kind of just one of these big cover designing houses, and that's really all I did at that point. So and again, at that point, I did not see this as a business. I saw it as just, hey, this is going to be cool to get my work out there. This is almost like a trial, like a beta version to test what KDP is all about, to look at their tools. And the book, I teach martial arts, and the book has a ton of martial arts in it. And it really was just aimed at that point at other martial artists. I wasn't even thinking about sci-fi fantasy, to be honest. I said, hey, this would be cool if some other martial artists could read it. And so that was iteration number one. And I kind of put it down until then, moved on to other things until there's a contest called SPFBO, which is fairly prevalent now and distinguished amongst indie authors in the sci-fi fantasy community. Mark Lawrence created it, and I think it's like now in the 9th or 10th even iteration of it. They run one per year, and it's fantastic. I was in the 6th one. I kind of submitted. I found out about it, like a couple days prior to the deadline that year. It was the pandemic year, 2020. So I of course was like going out of my mind, stuck in my house, and I don't know, doom scrolling or something, and saw that there was this contest, hadn't heard of it before, and said, hey, you know what? I have this manuscript that I previously self-published, the combat codes. Why don't I give it a shot and submit it? And surprisingly, in a sci-fi fantasy contest, or I guess it's fantasy, and that we can get to that. That was a big controversy actually with my book. We can get that separately. It's a fantasy contest, and I submitted it, and it did really well, and it got through to the finals, and that got a lot of eyes on it, and kind of was proof of concept that this book had legs for sci-fi fantasy readers beyond martial artists. And so then that was kind of like iteration number 2, where I actually put some more time and money into it. I hired a copy editor for a new iteration, and a cover designer, Felix Ortiz, who does fantastic work. And again, that was like version 2 for SPFBO, and it made it again to the finals. And so I did invest a bit more at that point, and also put some more marketing effort into it, because it was getting some more, a lot more eyeballs on it due to SPFBO and the way that it goes. There's judges, and they help promote it, and as it gets into the finals, there's a lot of promotion that goes into it. So I was trying to buoy that with more of my own marketing, and I tried out Amazon marketing, Facebook, Instagram, all of that stuff. At that point, to get a lot more eyes in it. And that's really how Orbit, one of the ways, it was probably multifaceted as far as how they found it, but one of the ways that it got under Orbit's radar as far as the traditional acquisition.
In terms of those different methods that you tried, did anything work better than the other things? Just thinking for listeners that might be wanting to try a similar thing.
I think, unfortunately, I'm not too scientific with the way I do it. So there's other people in the self-publishing space that would be a lot more, data driven on the way they're going to be able to tell you what works and what doesn't. But I really did find and again, there's no tried and true method to get into SPFBO, but I think that was probably without that as kind of a catalyst, I don't think I would have been as successful with the other marketing methods. Because it might have been, the old adage that, like, in order for someone to buy your book, they have to like see it 7 or 8 times. And I think that holds true with traditional. It may be a little different between self-pub and traditional, but I think that is true. And when I think about my own buying habits for books that I haven't heard of before, that does seem to be true. So I think it was like SPFBO, it was on people's radar in that community and people that followed that. And then if I were to get an ad in front of them through one of these other, whether it be Amazon or Facebook or Instagram, then that probably added to the conversion rate of getting people to get the book.
And, I mean, something that we've often heard from people who go down the traditional route is that it's all about where would the publisher see your book on a shelf, how do you market it? They need to be like, oh, this is a crime novel, this is a fantasy novel. And your novel, it seems to kind of crosses genres a little bit. Like, it's not easily marketable or definable, I think, as a lot of books might be. And I think that's a strength of it. But I can see from a traditional publisher's point of view, they would be a bit wary of that. But do you think you almost needed to go out there and proving that it had legs and and people were interested in it was almost an easier way to kind of get your foot in the door traditionally, as opposed to if you just went to them straight off the bat and they might have been like, oh, I don't know what we do with this kind of book.
Yeah, no, a few things there. I could talk about this a lot. I mean, to go back to the kind of cross genre, that was actually, I wouldn't say controversy, but that was a point of heated discussion within the SPFBO judging teams because, again, it's a fantasy competition, but a lot of judges in the finals saw it as a sci-fi book. And so they were like demoting they were like, well, I really loved your book, but it's not fantasy, 3 out of 10. So it became, but then other judges were like, no, it is. And it really opened up, it was great because it opened up so many discussions about that we love to talk about.
Well, loads of folks say Star Wars is a fantasy film, and I've never quite understood that, because to me it seems a very obvious
But it's Space
film.
Wizards.
But
well, there you go. You guys are going to have.
But then
to
surely
right
anything.
now.
But then you can make anything fantasy, and anything can be sci-fi.
Right,
so is that the argument? That basically,
fantastic.
Well, I go. I always refer to the first person to blurb my book, The Combat Codes, who is Fonda Lee, and I love her books, and she's far better at describing my own book than I am. So she described it as a science fantasy martial arts extravaganza, which I love. And again, that's the
fantasy, way. That's quite a nice.
Yes,
I like that.
And I do describe it as science fantasy because I don't come from a science background. I don't try any of the tech that is in the book. I don't try with any real effort to describe in detail. Because it's like, for example, I was just on a panel with author I love, Adrian Tchaikovsky, and it's like, if you read his books, it's like, yeah, this is sci-fi, and the way he describes it, it's truly sci-fi. The way he goes into detail about evolutionary processes and all that,
the technology works, all the back
right. And but mine is really, I would describe it as magitech. In fact, I'm heavily inspired by like Final Fantasy games and jRPGs, and those are not pigeonholed by genre like books are, and they don't like Final Fantasy games. If you look at them, they're not. You wouldn't say this is sci-fi or fantasy. You'd say this is like a jRPG to some effect. Totally. And anyways, to jump to your next point about whether or not it would have been easier to go through a traditional path. That's really tough for me to say because everything was pretty backwards with the way that I did it. And I don't think that, I think it would have, if it was the combat codes and I was querying it, it actually probably would have been more difficult than the path I took. But that is not me saying that the path I took is something that someone else should try necessarily, because I think it was just everything was lined up in the right place for it to work, as far as getting into SPFBO, as far as getting the right judging team that actually was behind the book and enjoyed the book enough to send it to the finals. There are just so many variables and factors that lined up, like with everything. But at each point, I pushed it as hard as I could. I put all the work I could, but then there's the factor of luck that is essential to get through each of these steps. In fact, the path to publication was even more backwards than one would expect, where I ended up with a film agent prior to getting a literary agent, prior to getting Orbit to pick up the book, which is also what ended up helping it, because the book was optioned or attempted to be optioned while it was self-pub. And then I didn't know what to do because I was like, what do I do here? And was able to get a film agent, a book to film agent. And then they were like, do you have a literary agent? And I was like, no, I don't have a literary agent because this book is self-published. And so there's no reason I would have one. So then I got a literary agent. And then we sold it for Orbit. So again, it seemed like everything was backwards.
You got your agent then before the Orbit deal was even on the horizon, or did the Orbit kind of interest help get you the agent?
It was around the same time, but I got my Ed Wilson, who's a great agent, prior to the Orbit deal, and he
And we've talked around it, but do you just want to tell us and the listeners what the combat codes is about?
Sure. Well, this is not a video interview, but I'll hold it up just to show
we can see it.
Again, Fonda Lee describes it best. A science fantasy martial arts extravaganza. It takes place in a world where wars between nations have been replaced with single combat duels between champions, and more specifically unarmed combat. So I've always been a fan of swords and sorcery, and but because I'm a martial artist, I wanted to create a world that didn't put weapons at the forefront. I just thought, how cool would it be? There's an academy setting. There's a found family trope that is at the center. There's two primary characters that kind of follow another trope, which is one of my favorites, like the lone wolf and cub trope, which you'll find in like The Mandalorian with Mando and Grogu, or Ciri and Geralt, or Ellie and Joel in The Last of Us. All those, they're like my favorite shows. I love that trope, and so that's kind of a centerpiece to it as well.
It's such a great concept for a story. There's no wars. It's just you get one chance. Each country puts forward, or nation puts forward, a person to fight someone else, and that's how they decide.
Right. I've heard. I don't know if it was from another author on your podcast or another podcast, or just talking with another author, but I've heard someone say that most stories come from either the seed of world building, the seed of character development, or the seed of narrative. And the combat codes definitely, thinking back on it, was from world building, asking the question, okay, what would a world look like that had that political system? And that created all these other questions, like, okay, like if you can imagine the Olympics and like what different countries do to make their athletes better, and like all the scandals that have happened with like doping, and can you imagine if it was the Olympics, but actually resources and land and diplomacy depended on these sports? What would happen to these people, like if the resources were right? And that kind of led down to, that's like what created the sci-fi aspect of this world.
And I want to ask you about timing as well, because a lot of our guests say that timing is so vital in terms of getting picked up, or a particular book's success and things like that. And obviously you entered SPFBO, what was it? Self-published fantasy blog off.
Some people say SPFBO, and that's another debate. People like to get in debates apparently in this community. It's SPFBO. I say SPFBO, but come on, either way.
I can think of one way to settle this argument.
Yes.
Side puts forward a fighter.
Yes. You and Tariq.
Oh God.
But I wondered, because obviously, I mean, you've already mentioned Fonda Lee, but her Jade Legacy books almost created or opened people's eyes to the idea of fantasy that isn't medieval. I mean, not just hers, but she had great success with that sort of book, and it's like yours. It has martial arts in it and things like that. So, do you think that the fact that these books were suddenly around and having success has helped with your own books, and people sort of thinking, "Oh, this is the sort of book that people actually like"? So I'll look at this.
Yeah, I think as far as acquisition, yes, 100%. Given I know the way that, or what I've learned, tried to glean from the mystery that is traditional publishing acquisitions, is that when an acquiring editor goes to acquisitions and needs to present an idea to the team to sell it to them, of course they need to make comps for books that are like within the last 5 years, and that's super important because again, they're making these, like a P&L that determines how much they're going to give for an advance and how much this book supposedly is going to make, and they have all those future predictions, which kind of come out of nowhere, to be honest. But they're trying to use data of past books that are similar and look at the demographics and audiences. So I think certainly Fonda's series was very instrumental as far as the science fantasy, and then the martial arts element. Of course, Jade City is far different in a lot of other ways, and Fonda is like a much different author than I am. And that's obviously another reason why we were able to get a blurb from her, which was so fantastic. It was so great that was like one of the best moments to get it, because I love the Greenbone saga. And then also a little older of a series, which is Red Rising, which was a really big hit by Pierce Brown. And that is a little more on the sci-fi side, but often people I've heard also describe that as science fantasy, because there's some tech, there's a bunch of tech in it, but there's also, as you guys said before, space, in a way, space wizards and space knights. Instead of lightsabers, they have like scythes and like various things like that. And so there's elements of, I would say, fantasy. And actually if you look at some of these books that cross over, that appeal to both science fiction and fantasy fans, they have some common themes like that. And again, they're not too heavy on the science part of science fiction, I would say.
And now that, you've kind of experienced both sides of it, because you wrote your first book, by yourself in your own head with no real network of support, and now you've written 2 more books in the trilogy. And am I right in saying that both of those 2 books came after you'd signed the deal with Orbit for the? So
I just published the 3rd book, and then Orbit acquired, and we pulled it down right away.
Okay.
So that one just got out.
But then, some people had a sneak peek.
But actually the 3 books with Orbit, interestingly enough, most authors get a little worried about traditional editor cutting their words. When I got acquired by Orbit, they were like, can you add 25% more to each of these books? So that, the books that are coming out now that are getting republished by Orbit are significantly different. I mean, like the narrative skeleton is similar. I don't want to say it's completely different, but there is quite a bit more character development, character storylines that are carried on further, which is awesome, because I had a chance. Most authors don't get a chance to go back at all the potential critiques they had and be like, actually, some of those are pretty good. I'm gonna get version 3 out here.
That's interesting. And how do you feel? I mean, I think I might know what your answer is now, but how do you feel comparing those 2 aspects of working on books by yourself or with a kind of network of team, of editors? Do you prefer having that support system in place now?
Yeah, I do. I really like for example, I wrote a screenplay recently with a friend, another author, and I had so much fun doing it. I love the collaborative aspect. And of course, with traditional publishing, co-writing is fairly difficult to do, but I just like the collaborative aspect. Like, I'm not the type of author that is married to my work, and I won't, and I think it's perfect and I won't change it. Like, I really try as hard as I can and actually enjoy working with editors, even copy editors. Like some of the copy edits that Orbit got me, I'm in awe of these people. Like, for example, a recent copy edit I get on the 2nd book was talking about, it wasn't it was like a world building copy edit. I guess that could be called a line edit almost. Based on the geography of the sun was setting. They noticed that I had made the sun set in the west from this nation, and this nation was positioned next to it, and therefore it was west instead of east. And it was these are things that I would not. I'm amazed at. I would never. I don't have the brain to catch this stuff in my own work.
There's someone out there who would have found it and would have went mental at you for
right. Exactly. They're like, the sun sets in the west, and you position this, and they're traveling. Yeah. So that sort of thing, and then also working with developmental editors. My editor Bradley at Orbit. They're so passionate, and I like that collaborative. The hard part though is the waiting, as we all know. You have to just those those flurries of collaboration are like not the regular, not the norm. The norm is like a black hole of nothing, and then you get a lot of collaboration, which I really thrive on.
And what is your process then? And has your process changed now that you have moved into a world where you're getting feedback and things like that? Do you, with the combat codes initially, did you sit down and plan it out, or did you just sort of pants it?
Yeah, I'm a lot more on the discovery side. I do have a problem with outlining where it kind of takes the fun out of it, I guess. And I've tried to outline, and I think it would be helpful. I think as a more of a pantser discovery writer, I definitely walk myself into problems. But it's just again, it's the way that I try to enjoy writing the most, like discovering where the characters are going. And as far as right now, again, because we're working in kind of a world that I've already built, it hasn't been a problem, or I haven't had to change much of it. With the new scenes, I've been able to work off of what's already there, so we haven't come up against any reason that I've had to change that process. It's just now during edits, there's just many additional layers of copy edits and structural edits and first pass, second pass. I don't know how many passes there are. There's a lot of passes.
Do you miss having any sort of are there things you miss about being self-pubbed, like the kind of, I guess the downside is that you have to do everything yourself, but the upside is that, well, you've got total control over everything, and that's, I guess, a good and bad thing. But like, the cover arts, for instance, was very different on your own version versus what it was changed to when Orbit bought it. And do you miss having that control, or are you quite happy to kind of network that out and share workarounds?
Yeah, I do miss it. There's certainly like the ability with self-pub to be able to, for example, get data on sales like day of. I think that's really a bit, and be able to pivot marketing based on, you could, like, for example, let's say you run a promotion, you can immediately see whether it worked or not, and then make changes based on what you see. And one would think that traditional is doing that, but they're obviously, bandwidth is an issue, and they're not working usually to that level of granularity. So my book is just now, tomorrow, which is June 13th, is the release date. And I'm not expecting, based on what I've heard, to get sales data, like real sales data, accurate sales data, for, I don't know, several months. So that does kind of make me a little insane. I'm trying to not go insane, because but based on what I'm used to, my inclination is to want to view the sales data. But at the same time, it could be good for me that I'm not like hovering over a line chart and looking at it. It might be nice for allowing me to work on, my next draft, work on the next thing, as opposed to being so married. I mean, again, goes back to running a business. If I were running a business, you want to know this data, but in this case, I have so much less control. So I kind of need to relinquish it. It's just, I guess it's like kind of a give and take type of thing.
Yeah.
I was going to ask as well about the fight scenes in the book, because obviously you mentioned you teach martial arts. You are an expert at it, and it was actually we're on a Discord with Nicholas Binge, who wrote Ascension, and he had
I hung out with Nick at Comic-Con in London. He's a great guy.
Yeah, so he had said something on the Discord today, because they were talking about, I was just trying to find the comment, but I couldn't find it, about what writers can tend to do if they're starting out is like over describe things like fight scenes and things like that. But he said, in fact, the exception I would make is the combat codes by Alexander Darwin, because the fight scenes in that are perfect. They're just written in a way that's very visceral and takes you in there and is what you need. So, I mean, do you when you're writing a fight scene like that, do you not even plan that out? Do you just kind of think in your head, right, what would happen next? What would happen next? Or do you have a sort of choreography that you're thinking about when you're writing something like that?
Yeah, no, I have talked about this quite a bit, and kind of the conclusion that I've come to is anytime you have an expertise in something, like, for example, let's say Adrian Tchaikovsky again with science, or any author that has an expertise, Christian Cameron or John Gwynne with medieval weaponry and that, that form of combat, it lends, if done right, it will lend authenticity to the book, to the reader, and to the book that is very noticeable, that a reader will notice right away. However, you can also, as you said, fall into a trap where you're over explaining something because you have a knowledge of a subject. So there is a balance that needs to be struck. I do see, I mean, of course, again, so my expertise in martial arts, grappling, and mixed martial arts, definitely I think has done well to lend a authenticity to these scenes. However, I've really had to, both working with editors as well as in my own edits, not only make sure it's going to be palatable to a normal audience that doesn't have this expertise, but also create, I almost see like writing fight scenes like dialogue in a lot of ways, where you can have a scene that's very dry and you don't really see the dialogue as having a purpose because there's no stakes. And the same goes with the fight scene. If there's no stakes, if you don't feel any tension, it will end up very dry. And that's where, the authenticity won't matter, because it'll just go over the reader's head. The authenticity will only come into play where they'll say, "Oh, this seems real," if there are if there is the tension created and the stakes that the reader will feel. It's kind of like I always go back to Star Wars, where they're firing the blasters everywhere and no one's getting hit, and it's like, especially after, like, I think in the beginning of the movie they said the stormtroopers are like so well trained, and then no one's getting hit and it's just bouncing off. And then actually in the recent Star Wars Andor, they show in a very early scene someone get shot and they like die. And I'm like, okay, now this actually is completely different. You've just created like stakes. And I think you can really go into detail as long as it's not over inundating a reader, as long as you have those elements. And there's certain techniques which I've tried to utilize, which could be utilized for any scene, like, going kind of like zooming out as you would, and not staying on one character necessarily, kind of like Joe Abercrombie does a really good job of that, in my opinion, in his fight scenes.
I mean, it sounds to me like you're a very visual writer, and I know you've obviously worked on scripts and stuff, and I get the impression you kind of see things visually in your head, how they play out, and that's how you kind of imagine the story. But when you're writing it, and you're touching there about things like authenticity and things, and imagine when it's a kind of sci-fi or science fantasy story where you could do anything, and there's no limit. You need to almost create that kind of artificial limit to ground the world, and something like, you've got like Kill Bill, which is a kind of martial art movie, and it's kind of grounded, but then they do crazy fight moves and they're leaping about and spinning, and the 5-point palm exploding heart technique and stuff, which is crazy, but it works in that world.
Right, it does. I love that. I love the movie. I love the second one even more. Yeah, especially when, exactly what you're saying, where they're my favorite scene is where they're on the plane. I don't remember when she's on the plane and you see everyone has like samurai sword holders on the plane. Yeah. It's
kind of weird world that
yeah,
but they've set the rules, and it's like, cool, this is the rules. It's okay. I understand what the limits are, even though it's a made up semi-real world.
Right. Yeah, you're working with kind of an open framework, like an open API, open framework. So you do have to create those rules. And again, I think that's true with even whether it's fantasy or sci-fi. You can write the most unbelievable, the most crazy, or the most realistic. Like you have, like the beginning of Nick Binge's book Ascension. Like it starts fairly, like it's almost like a less sci-fi and more like thriller, like Jurassic Park. And Jurassic Park's another great example where they're more grounded in the real world, but it's all about keeping the reader within the walls that you've created.
Exactly.
Otherwise you kind of lose them.
Yeah.
And are you able to say what's happening in relation to the film interest in the combat codes?
Yeah, no, that's kind of, as I'm sure a lot of authors you've talked to or have heard from, with the writer's strike currently, everything is seems to be kind of on hold. I know there's still like apparently some things that are going on as far as development, but like obviously no one is. I'm not a screenwriter per se. I've tried my hand at it, but I wouldn't be good enough to write my own script, and no one would want to buy it. Or so I think a screenwriter would of course be a requirement for a next step, and that's always seemingly the first step. And I think right now it seems like a lot of that is on hold.
And so the Combat Codes is out tomorrow, you said, as we record this. What is in the pipeline for you after this?
Yeah, so it's all right now. I mean, I have some other projects, but right now, because it's a trilogy and we're going to release one every 6 months, it's all hands on deck as far as Combat Codes. The second book, actually, they just did the cover release for it today. Grievar's Blood is out before the holidays in December, and then the third one will be out around this time in 2024. So, and also because I'm adding so much material to each book, which requires like the drafting process again, it's more than just the developmental edits. It's like a whole extra step that is right now required for that. And then I mean, I'm gonna see how hopefully this book does well, and I'll be able to sell the next one. I know I don't know if you can sell something on pitch depending on how your first book does. I think that would be nice, but or sell a manuscript.
Do you have ideas though? Are they separate from this universe, or?
Yeah, I have a few drafts that in between all this, SPFBO acquisition, which as we know goes so slow, that I've written. And again, my drafts, because I'm a discovery writer, are almost more outlines, so to speak. I treat them almost like outlines with a bunch of dialogue and very loose descriptions attached to them. And so I like to sit those down for like a year, even 6 months to a year, and then come back at them with fresh eyes and decide whether they're worth jumping into. I have one which is like the comps would be Westworld meets Wolverine, which cool. I'm thinking about thinking about working on, and we'll see how that. Again, I have to come back to it. I'm thinking of changing something from third person to first person, seeing how that kind of plays with it. I haven't written something in first person yet, so I'm interested in doing that. I think it would work for this particular story.
That sounds awesome.
That sounds very cool. Yeah,
and obviously, Combat Codes, you're in a sort of unusual position in the sense that you're on the eve of publication, but it has been out before, so you've kind of got a sense of what people think about it already. But do you still have those sort of pre-publication nerves about it?
Oh yeah, I'm super. Ask my wife. I'm driving her crazy this week. Yeah, I definitely 100% do. First of all, another thing between self-pub and traditional is like there's crossover with the audiences, but based on the actual like Kindle Unlimited, a lot of self-pub read on Kindle Unlimited, and my book was previously on that, and that's almost like its own walled garden where a lot of people that subscribe to that will only read that,
right?
And because which makes sense, they pay for that subscription. There's a lot of books on there. So this is really a whole new, which is one of the reasons why traditional publishing, I think, was the right path. Is it's a whole new audience for the book. So it's almost like, and they also, luckily, there are a lot of readers that have followed along and are interested in repicking it up because it's changed quite a bit, and are getting behind it, which I'm very thankful for. But yeah, the nerves are right there. There's launch events and stuff like that, which I'm glad I did a tour in the UK because I kind of like was able to go through some of those events and practice whatever pitches and talking to people. So hopefully that will diminish the nerves, but who knows?
But also, I suppose this is the kind of only time folk will find out how the story ends, because they've never, or unless they were very quick with book 3, they've not really had a chance to see
Yeah.
it.
Yes.
So maybe
Yes.
they've read the first 2 books and they think, well,
Yeah, and
I'm
who
gonna have
knows?
to buy
Maybe
it
I'll
again.
change. I might change how book 3 ends. In fact, like I was able to plug a lot of potential holes in the first way around. So I think book 3 will be the one that probably gets the biggest overhaul. But I'm excited for book 2. I've always liked middles as well. Middles are always my favorite.
Which one did you find hardest to write? Because when we've spoken to people, sometimes the obviously book 1, you're setting up the world, you're setting up the characters, and so you've got to lay a lot of the groundwork in book 1, and it's got to work completely as a standalone normally. Book 2, you're suddenly constrained by what you've set out in book 1, and you've got to have bigger stakes than book 1, but you can't have them too big because you've got to end it all in book 3. So and book 3, you've got to draw all the threads of the other books together in a neat way that's satisfying. So I mean, which are all different challenges in and of themselves, but what did you find the most difficult one to write?
Yeah, but definitely book 3. And I think it's like my personality. Book 2 I had the most fun with, actually, because it's like you've met all your characters, you know who they are, you know the world and the structure, and now you get to play in the sandbox you created. And that for me was so much fun. And I personally like reading book 2s as well. I know a lot of people disagree with that, but I as a reader, you know the characters, you don't have to invest. It's hard to invest in a sci-fi fantasy world because you have to learn all the various terminologies. And mine's not that heavy, especially comparative with a lot of high fantasy, as far as that terminology, but you do have to invest as a reader. And then once you get to know them in book 2, it's kind of like smooth sailing and you get to go on all the adventures. And so I did have a lot of fun writing book 2. Book 3 is again, for those reasons, you have all these characters and as an author, you formed relationships with them and you want to send them off in the right way.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of pressure. And it's actually, I think, technically very tough. All the threads that you have tied. And I think it will, just based on having the resources of Orbit, and just like the line edits that I talked about with the sunsetting, I think that will make it quite a bit easier, keeping a lot of the world building straight.
Yeah, I often think that, especially the kind of ending of things, especially big epics, it's tough, and I feel if
You're talking about
goes,
Dark Tower, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, a little bit of Dark Tower, yeah. And I feel like, because that's what people remember, right? Like if it doesn't, or Mass Effect or something where, you know, the ending didn't really click with people, and everyone's like, it kind of sours the whole experience, and it's unfair because you could have enjoyed the first 6 books or the first 2.5 hours. But
I think that's why that we have authors that just fall off the map. Like, we all know who they are, but I think that's why the pressure grows. So it's like not even about the audience. They're feeling pressure from the audience, but end of the day, why are we authors, and we want to tell stories that we enjoy? And I think it's almost pressure on yourself to give the characters justice. So I think that's why these famous cases where authors have just dropped off, they probably just have this self pressure to do their characters right, especially in the final of a trilogy. And I agree with you completely, Tariq.
Especially as well if someone else has finished the story for you in a different format, and then you now have to then try and do it.
Is not going to finish that series, I don't think.
And the expectations grow as the longer you take it. Also,
totally.
Right,
totally. What was the last book that you read?
Yeah, actually, we had already touched on it. Mutual friend, Nick Binge. I finished Ascension right as I was traveling to London on the plane, and I had a fantastic time with it. I mean, like, I see why it was like a big. It got optioned in an auction by so many movie production companies, because you can just picture it as you're reading it as a thriller. And I think also for the fact that I think I talked to Nick about this, like a lot of books, especially high fantasy books, from a production standpoint of a movie studio, would cost, like, you know, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I think, you know, his book, obviously, I think he had described himself, you just need like a bunch of like winter snow scenes and people yelling and
That's a good point.
And sort of monsters that you can't quite see what's happening and things
right,
like that.
like it would be very character heavy. So that I had a fantastic time with Ascension.
Yeah, it's a great book. What about the last film that you watched?
Oh, film. So I have 3 little kids, and I think next I used to be watching like many movies a week, and my film watching habits have sadly dried up quite a bit. I went to London and I watched 2. That's where I get all my movie watching, on the plane and the tiny little screen. I watched The Menu. That was totally through. I was like, especially in the setting of watching it on the plane, I was like sweating. That was really good. I think I watched an action. I'm trying to remember, just like kind of a mindless action movie, which I was a fan of. I don't even remember what it was, but I just passing the time.
Cool.
TV shows, though, is that a separate question? TV
well,
shows?
I was about to ask you, but go on to that. Yeah, TV show.
Oh, TV shows. My wife and I are watching Silo, which we're really enjoying.
Oh yeah,
nice.
I want to watch that. Yeah.
Looking forward to that. Yeah.
Right. The character, I mean, and sometimes with sci-fi fantasy, my wife is not as big of a fan. But I know, like there's certain shows that she'll watch because clearly they stand on their own. Another was like Andor, even though she is not that into Star Wars, she was able to watch it because you could like take the characters and place them in any world. And then another show that I did not recently watch, but is actually scheduled to, the 3rd season is going to be out at the end of June, is Warrior on Max. I guess it's called Max now.
Yeah,
I'm just going to keep saying that show is fantastic. It's one of the best martial arts shows. And it's not just martial arts. It takes place in like turn of the 19th century San Francisco, just when like a lot of immigrants, like Chinese immigrants, Irish immigrants, were like being used to dig the railroads, and so it's actually a screenplay that was written originally by Bruce Lee.
Cool.
And the story is like apparently that's the reason that show Kane got made a long time ago. But this is like actually doing justice to the screenplay. His daughter is a producer and
nice.
on the show, and it's real. The characters are fantastic. It's kind of like you were talking about with Kill Bill, Tariq. Like it creates its own world so well that's not necessarily believable or real, but like you believe it, and it makes you suspend your disbelief really well.
Did you watch that? There was the other martial arts show,
Into the Badlands.
Yes.
That was super fun. That's another one. Like it's kind of sci-fi martial arts.
Yeah, like in a wasteland.
It's too bad it got canceled. That was on, I think, AMC or something.
Yeah, no, that was good. I quite liked that one. Although it was very odd when the guy Simon Pegg's pal turned up in it.
Nick Frost.
Yeah.
Was he in there? Was he?
He was in it. Not who you would expect in a martial arts film, but martial arts series.
Well, the very, very last thing we always do is a super quick fire either or, and as you'll know, there's always one correct answer to give. But we'll start off with Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee.
Oh, they're both good in their own ways. I'm just gonna go with Bruce Lee based on overall impact, even though I really like Jackie Chan and yeah.
Cool. TV or cinema?
Lately I've been, again, you can tell I've been watching a lot more TV, but I'm going to go with cinema just because I was actually a film major in university, and that was my original love, and I'm going to stick with it.
Nice. Night owl or early bird?
So by nature, like if I was in an untouched environment, aka without kids, I like writing in the morning. I like sipping coffee and reading a book in the morning, but I just can't do that. So I think I am an early bird, but I've been forced to do my work more at night, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
because
you're getting woken up to do other stuff in the morning. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Music or no music when you're writing?
Yeah. So this is another one where I would love to be able to write with music because I love listening to soundtracks, but I've found over the past several years they affect the writing too much. Editing though, music for editing all day long.
Okay, cool.
And the last question, and the most important one, in my view. Now, you seem like quite a tech savvy guy, so I'm going to say real book or ebook.
Yeah. I see the value in ebooks. I travel with them.
No.
I see the yes. But especially recently, as like publishers have been sending me like arcs and stuff, and I've been like smelling the books, and I really do.
God.
You got you can't. I mean, if Tariq, if they released a Kindle, if they have the next version of Kindle and they have a button, right? You press the button. I would go with it. So it just needs that one feature whatever Kindle version they're on.
I like that. That's a smart move. I can see that.
That's what Nick Harkaway said as well. An ebook that looked like a real book, but it could have all the books on it, essentially. So yeah, if you could make an ebook that was like a real book, but it had everything in it, that's what you want.
They just need the smell.
Yeah,
that's all that's missing.
Cool. Well, thanks very much, Alex. That was a lot of fun.
That was great fun.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Big fan of the podcast, and excited to listen to the next one too. After mine, I won't listen to mine.
Well, I mean, I know technically the guy picked hard books over ebooks, but he's obviously not quite right in the head, because that whole smelling books, that's just those people shouldn't be asked a question. They're just completely weirdos.
Lots of people like the smell of a new book.
Lots of people should be locked up in prison, Marco.
Seems a bit harsh. But yeah, you could have won him over if you can invent that Kindle that has the smell, a button to make it smell of a real book.
That just releases the gas of
exactly.
What even is that smell? Paper?
It must be like a mix of the paper, the ink, and the glue, I guess, together. So in fact, it's like sniffing glue. Exactly. Yeah. No, thanks very much to Alex for coming on to the podcast. We did record that one back in June, so apologies that it's taken a bit of time to get that one out there, but I think it was worth waiting for. As I said at the start, I think the chat about the whole self-publishing journey, we had this a bit last week with Mark Edwards as well, but it's always interesting hearing about how authors have made a success of that, and also even what he was saying, now that he's traditionally published, he doesn't have that sort of micro control of the data, of the ability to sort of turn a new advertising campaign on, or things like that, just to try and keep the book relevant. And I suppose that when you're with a trad publisher, that's kind of the payoff that you make. You get a lot of backup, you get a lot of help, editors, etc., and obviously there are huge benefits, but you do lose a bit of the control.
Yeah.
And if you're someone that likes managing that, then I can imagine it's a bit difficult.
And I think it's really good to have chatted to all these authors who have kind of a foot in both worlds, or have experience of both worlds, and are able to lay out the differences and the pros and cons, because I think for so long self-publishing was always seen as a kind of poor man's way into the industry, or if you can't get anywhere else, try self-publishing, and I think that's just not the case. And I think there are very many positive reasons to go down the self-pub route that you don't get through the traditional route, such as the control of advertising and marketing and tweaking things.
I think that's right. And I think it's clear from the people that we've spoken to, Alex, Mark Edwards, Ryan Cale's another one that jumps in my head. You have to treat it like a job. You have to put the effort in to make a success of it. But if you do it professionally, if you get a proper book cover, if you get an editor and all of this sort of stuff, then you can make as good a product as a traditional product. And in fact, some cases you'll be putting more effort into it than a traditional publisher would put into it. So I think even for authors, though, it can be still a bit of a that sort of inbuilt idea that self-publishing isn't worthy as worthy as trad publishing. I think it is still a step that a lot of people need to get over. And I think as long as it's done in that professional way, then there isn't really much of a difference between the two these days.
At the end of the day, yes, seeing your book on a bookshelf is, that kind of selfish, that kind of wanting to see it for your own sake, etc. But at the end of the day, you're still an author, you're still writing books, people are still reading what you're writing, and that is the most important thing.
I just think of the thing that always makes me pause is if you're at a party or something and someone says, what do you do? And you say, oh, I write books. And they say, oh, who are you with or whatever? You say, oh, I self-publish. Then they'd immediately think, oh, right, you're not a real writer,
Yeah.
So I think there is still a societal
definitely
100% snobbery and
definitely people
about
out there. Yeah.
So,
but they're just idiots.
Yes, indeed. So thanks very much to Alex for coming on. Combat Codes is out now, and as we heard, the next one will be out very soon as well. So definitely go and pick those up. And next week we have another great guest and someone that is one of our main rivals in terms of podcasting.
Yeah. We're chatting with Sunya Dean, who has written The Book Eaters, as her first novel a few years ago, and as Marco said, is the co-host of the Publishing Rodeo podcast, our number one rival.
Yes, indeed.
Podcast chart.
No, it's a very good podcast because it's a very good podcast. Looks behind the scenes, I guess, and tells the raw stories, I suppose. Is that what you would say?
Yes.
Of the difficulties that even when you're published or whatever, or trying to get into publishing, what the difficulties can be found on the road there. So it's definitely worth tuning into that one, as long as you don't drop this podcast. Otherwise, I wouldn't listen to it at all.
There's room for both, but if there's only room for one, then you obviously pick ours.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great chat with Sunya, so please do tune in for that one. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please do take the time to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your favourite podcast app, as that helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast and helps us to get close to the Publishing Rodeo podcast in the charts.
And of course, if you would like to get in touch with us, you could always drop us an email, which is podcast@rightgear.co.uk, or you can find us on every single social media platform out there. Just search for
not TikTok until you start
we're
learning
not
how
on
to
TikTok,
dance.
Marco. You can find us on everywhere apart from TikTok by searching for @UKPage1. And if you're on Mastodon, then we are writing.exchange/@page1pod.
Yep, so have a great week and we'll speak to you next episode.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.